Many of you might be familiar with the book The Kite Runner by Khalid Hosseini. The Kite Runner, written about 18 years ago, follows a young boy, Amir, who was living in Afghanistan in the 1960s. Amir lives a life of privilege, and the whole story is shaped around his brotherly friendship with Hassan, his servant's son. They have a beautiful friendship. But you find out later in the book that Amir betrays Hassan in a tragic way. So the novel opens in the voice of Amir as a 38-year-old man living in San Francisco, looking back on this time. I became what I am today at the age of 12 on a frigid, overcast day in the winter of 1975. I remember the precise moment, crouching behind a crumbling mud wall, peeking into the alley near the frozen creek. That was a long time ago. But it's wrong what they say about the past, I've learned, about how you can bury it, because the past claws its way out. Looking back now, I realize I have been peeking into that deserted alley for the last 26 years. One day last summer, my friend Rahim Khan called from Pakistan. He asked me to come see him. And standing in the kitchen with the receiver to my ear, I knew it wasn't just Rahim Khan on the line. It was my past of unatoned sins. After I hung up, I went for a walk along Spreckles Lake on the northern edge of Golden Gate Park. I sat on a park bench near a willow tree. I thought about something Rahim Khan said just before he hung up, almost as an afterthought. There is a way to be good again. Maybe it's what many of us long to hear. There is a way to be good again. Because if you're like me, there are moments when the past claws its way out and my unatoned sins haunt me. I don't know if it's possible for any of us in this room to be able to say with confidence the words read so beautifully this morning, "Therefore, dark past, I'm about to do it. I'm about to forgive you for everything." I don't know that I can say that yet. How about you? So here's where we come to Peter. Now, I don't know if the poet is forgiving the past or forgiving herself, or if those two are inseparable. But I know this, that Peter betrayed not only his teacher, but a beautiful friendship. Last week, we saw Peter saying, "Oh, Lord, don't wash my feet." And when Jesus said, "If I don't, you won't have any part of me," him saying, "Well, then wash all of me." Impetuous Peter. Peter who's saying, "Jesus, I will love you to the end. I'm your guy." And we find him just hours, half day later, saying, "I don't know that man." He had two more chances to redeem himself after the first time he said it. And finally, in another gospel, it says, finally, cursing, he said, "I do not know him." Then the cock crows. Now, we know the end of the story. History gives us that benefit. We know that that is not the end of the story, at least for Peter. It was the end of the story for Judas when Judas betrayed him, wasn't it? But Peter did not go the way of Judas. Peter made a different choice. We all crave stories, I think, of redemption, of second chances, of starting over, of an opportunity to be good again. And why? Because as we heard so vividly in the children's moment today, we all, except Mike, make mistakes. Being alive is making mistakes. No one escapes failures. And we can learn from Peter. We can learn from Peter that, as someone said, our humanity is not a stumbling block to God. We can learn from Peter to let go of some of those things in the past. We can learn from Peter, I think, about self-forgiveness. Because as you read the quote in the bulletin this morning from Cormac McCarthy, it's always himself the coward abandons first. All other betrayals come easily then. So I want to lift up Peter as an example of self-forgiveness. Self-forgiveness and self-compassion. From a spiritual point of view, it's more than having a good self-image. It's more than talking about self-worth, although those things are part of it. But for me, it's about two things. First of all, it's about the unrealistic expectations we have about ourselves, especially in our Silicon Valley culture. Brene Brown, who does so much work on shame and vulnerability as a social scientist, quotes Lynn Twist in The Soul of Money, and Twist says, "For me and for many of us, our first waking thought of the day is, I didn't get enough sleep. The next one is, I don't have enough time." Clearly, I'm striking a chord here. Whether true or not, that thought of not enough occurs to us automatically before we even think to question or examine it. We spend most of the hours and the days of our lives hearing, explaining, complaining, or worrying about what we don't have enough of. Before we even sit up in bed, before our feet touch the floor, we're already inadequate. Already behind, already losing, already lacking something. And by the time we go to bed at night, our minds are racing with a litany of what we didn't get or didn't get done that day. We go to sleep burdened by those thoughts and wake up to that reverie of lack. This internal condition of scarcity, this mindset of scarcity, lives at the very heart of our jealousies, our greed, our prejudice, and our arguments with life. Here's the thing, friends. That sense of not enough easily translates unintentionally and often subconsciously into I am not enough. So I'm talking about that unrealistic expectation that we often have of our selves and live with this kind of underlying malaise of we're not quite getting it right. I know I'm not alone in this. I see a few bobbleheads out there going. But I'm also talking about in self-forgiveness and self-compassion, I'm also talking about the things that haunt us, the mistakes that we have made, the people that we have hurt and betrayed, the times we have betrayed ourselves. I have my own list. I'm not telling you what it is, but... And I know you have yours. Unless you've done a lot of work on self-forgiveness already. So again, I want to suggest that Peter provides a model of self-forgiveness because we know that his story didn't end there. We know that he went on to be the leader of the church. So what can we learn from Peter? Well, first of all, in this journey of self-forgiveness, he stayed in relationship. He stayed in the relationship. Forgiving self and forgiving others is the nature of relationships. You are not in a meaningful or intimate relationship today that's healthy if you haven't practiced forgiveness. Now, there's no record that we have anyway of Peter saying, "I'm sorry," to Jesus. But we have a record of him turning things around, becoming a very different person. Somehow he must have made amends, because for some of our past sins, we need to make restitution and amends. Just recently, I received a card from someone I worked with more than 20 years ago. This person had struggled with addiction when we worked together. Wildly talented person whom I adored. We're still in relationship to this day. But he's gotten into recovery after all these years, and he was doing one of his steps in making amends. And so out of the blue, I get this card, and I open it up, and it begins with, "Dear Penny, I'm sorry." He relates this incident that I, frankly, had forgotten about. It was a big deal at the time. He left me in a really difficult position. But he asked for forgiveness, giving the details of what he had done and that there was no excuse for it, and asked that I would forgive him. Well, what he didn't know was that I had forgiven him a long time ago. I'd forgotten about the incident, but it was holding him hostage. And so I immediately wrote him back and said, "Forgave you a long time ago, but let me tell you what I think of when I think of you. I think of an amazing Christian, a talented and skilled, loving person who over the 10 years that we worked together was faithful and showed me the face of Christ more times than I can remember. That's what I think when I think of you." And that released him in some way. I only said what was true for me. But we stayed in relationship, and his path to self-forgiveness, I'm sure a number of people got handwritten notes like that from him. But to practice self-forgiveness is to stay in relationship with people. The other thing Peter did is that he showed up. He continued to show up, because sometimes what we do is we isolate or we run away or we avoid, right? We're all, I think, fairly good at avoiding. There's few of us that welcome controversy or conflict. Most of us are very good at avoiding it at nearly any cost. But Peter showed up. He had guilt. I did something bad, but that's different from shame. And shame says, I am bad. And there's a world of difference. And I'll tell you this, if you are isolating yourself because of what you're feeling about yourself or some past mistakes, if you're isolating yourself or avoiding, it may be because there's shame. And self-forgiveness can heal shame. Another thing Peter did is he didn't let his failure define him, because none of us want to be defined by our worst acts. Aren't you glad that one of your worst acts is not recorded in some sacred text that has lasted 2,000 years? I mean, think about it. When we don't let failure define us, when we can make meaning from our past and meaning from our mistakes, when we can heal shame, then we can engage with the world from a sense of worthiness, a sense of belonging, a sense I am fully alive, and that means, yes, I've made mistakes along the way, I've hurt people, and I've been hurt. But that's not the end of the story. I was listening to a video by Rabbi Daniel Hartman, who I studied with in Israel. He was talking about the rejection of the Jewish people and about their own journey. And then he all of a sudden switched into kind of a personal narrative. And he said, failure is not an end. The minute you didn't get 100%, the story is not over. Failure is an essential part of the way you grow. He said, I am not the sum total of my successes. I am the sum total of what I did in response to my failures. I am the sum total of what I did in response to my failures. A few years ago, I preached on this text or this quote that I can't find who said it, but let your setbacks, anybody remember? Become your setups for your comebacks. Let your setbacks become your setups for your comebacks. Got it? Let your setbacks become for your... You got it. Great. Because we're all going to need it, because we're going to have setbacks. Because we make mistakes, we fail, but it's not the end of the story, and that's not what defines us. And lastly, Peter opened to grace. He received grace. Jesus made space in his life for Peter, and Peter took it. He stepped in and received grace, and his healing began. The great philosopher and theologian Paul Tillich says, we cannot transform our lives unless we allow them to be transformed, to be struck by grace. Grace strikes us when we are in great pain and restlessness. It strikes us when we walk through the dark valley of a meaningless and empty life. It strikes us when we feel that our separation is deeper than usual because we have hurt another. It strikes us when our disgust for our own indifference, our weakness, our hostility, our lack of direction and composure have become intolerable to us. It strikes us when year after year the longed-for perfection of life does not appear. When the old compulsions reign within us as they have for decades. Sometimes at that moment, a wave of light breaks into our darkness, and it is as though a voice were saying, you are accepted. You are accepted. Accepted by that which is greater than you, in the name of which you do not know. You are accepted. And if you simply accept that fact, you cannot make it happen, you cannot perform it into happening, you cannot earn it into happening. If you accept that fact, you have experienced grace. And you have experienced acceptance. I don't know, maybe the poet experienced such a stroke of grace that she was able to say, therefore, dark past, I'm about to do it. I'm about to forgive you for everything. What would that be like, friends? To not be defined by our failures, to not be weighed down by the hurts that we have inflicted in our past. To give up that notion of perfectionism and unrealistic expectations. Yes, to make amends where we need to. But to know that our worthiness is not linked to failure or success. but our acceptance simply is. That's grace. That's unconditional love that is available to every one of us. And that, I believe, is what it means to be fully human. Amen.